So yeah, next on the list of interesting trailers, Konami finally showed off gameplay of Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater, the remake of Metal Gear Solid 3. And the initial trailer that they showed was basically just nature footage, showing some of areas from the early in the game, but no characters. And it did look a little odd in some ways. But seeing this gameplay footage here, I'm fascinated by it because it looks good, I would say. I'm very happy with what they're doing here visually. It also looks surprisingly like they've essentially just taken the core animation framework and design of the original game and brought it into this new technology base, right? Like the animation, the rigging, all of that stuff seems very similar to the original. You can see it both in the cutscenes and the gameplay, which is not a bad thing. It's just, it's interesting to see it when applied to these extremely high detailed models, right? So like there's the part where he like runs, you can really see it with the the CQC when he runs in there and just does all that kind of stuff. It feels very much like that.
There's actually one shot that I thought was interesting where Snake kind of rolls into the prone position and he doesn't hit the ground with any sort of velocity. He kind of just hits a perfect prone and is flat as a board, straight
then
as a
stops.
board.
Yeah.
And then it kind of feels like the game's presentation on PS2 is being preserved here, and there is probably a certain responsiveness to that, I would have to think, in terms of the animation, perhaps. But it does feel like out of step with the rest of the game. Like, it does feel totally like you're looking at kind of PS2 animation frameworks, but everything else is very modern looking, you know?
These games has a very precise feeling to them in the animation, but that also makes it look a little less natural. And it's just kind of the way it worked at the time. And I thought it worked well, but it does have a strange sort of appearance when you see that mapped onto these high-end visuals. So I'm very curious to see how that actually plays out.
Definitely want to call out UE5 here.
Yeah, definitely.
Really obvious in a lot of areas. The character getting out, I recall, jumping out of the back with the gas mask on, jumping out of the back of the airplane. You can see like the reflections in their in the glass of the goggles.
The visor.
The visor, thank you. And another thing that I really think is interesting is that in games of this era, like it's like Far Cry 2, like initial areas where like there's these like paths and they're all like structured by there being like kind of really steep hills next to where the path is, and it's like maintained, like that's another like visual thing, like the animation where it's like very snappy, and I don't want to say lacking momentum, but it's definitely designed around gameplay first versus just visual flair. And that is another thing where it's gameplay first, where like, no, we're locking you into this area, even though it doesn't make any sense that there's like, 30-meter hills that are extremely sloped right next to like jungle terrain. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. But they're keeping that too. I'm curious to see what it's like in person. I think there's been a lot of negativity about this. People don't like Konami. I also probably don't like Konami on some level, but we don't see this game play that often these days. Stealth action,
right? Not like this.
Not like this. So, especially with like the weird systems interactions that these games can have. So I'm excited for that, just to play that all again for sure.
And yeah, that's a really good point about the walls and such. And I think I'm actually glad that they kept that, because that is the level design. And that's specifically what makes the levels work. But there are certainly larger open areas. Like as you're funneled through those spots, you end up in areas where there's like a huge camp with like all these buildings that you can both enter every building, you can crawl under every building, and all of that was done in the original game. And that opens up. So Metal Gear Solid subscribes to what I always call the wide linear style of gameplay, where it is just ultimately a straight line that you're following, but along the way it opens up and there's wide areas within that you can then tackle, and figuring out how to play through them and sort of playing with them almost like a toy is a part of the appeal, I would say. And that's something that Metal Gear is usually excelled in. So I'm happy that they've kept that sort of design focus. It really, really, really seems to hold true to it, and more than I expected them to, actually. In a way, it's almost like It reminds me a bit of a Blue Point style production, though perhaps even more slavish to the original. You know, if you look at like Demon Souls PS5 or Shadow of the Colossus, they made changes to things like animation in a way. Like things looked more fluid overall in a different way compared to this. This feels very much like it's staying true to the original game. One thing I did notice, though, is that there's this inconsistent use of motion blur, in that some scenes have nice per pixel motion blur, but then you have scenes like there's a late game scene where you're riding in the sidecar and you're firing a rocket launcher at guys driving through this valley, and for whatever reason, there's no motion blur there, and it would really benefit from it, I think.
I think one thing that does look good, though, and kind of reminds me of the MGS3 pachinko machine. I think you might remember that. Was it a pachinko machine?
It was a Pachi slot machine, yeah.
Pachi slot, okay, yeah. Is the cutscenes actually look quite good, I think, in this. You know, I love the way, especially they've redone those kind of like intro cinematics to MGS3. It just looks very iconic, and I got that same feeling of like, oh, this is a stealth mission in the jungle, and it's very cool and all that stuff. And I think they've done a really good job in terms of replicating all the right notes, but done in UE5, done pretty well. One thing though is that facial animation is not 100% there. Now, relative to the PS2, I'm sure it's more involved, but relative to other big budget titles of a similar fidelity, to me it looked a little bit off. Now, there isn't too much of it here, so maybe that's just a presumption on my part, but it doesn't look quite perfect in this showing. So maybe that's evidence of, again, the animation frameworks, they're not keeping up with the rest of the presentation.
It actually looked very similar to the original in that regard as well. I would say, like, and all the cutscene animation and the camera work, everything was like a 1-to-1 copy of the original game, from what I could tell. Like, I've played that intro so many times that just seeing those angles again in every shot, you're like, that's exactly the original game, shot for shot. Right. One thing that's interesting, though, is that obviously this will be a normal third-person camera system, right? And that's what most people that have played MGS3 now would know it for. But recently I loaded up the original version that came out, and I kind of lament the loss of, or the defocusing on the fixed camera stuff. I believe it was optional in Subsistence as well, though. You could actually like toggle between
the original.
But are you familiar with the original version, guys? Where it's like rather than using a third-person camera, it's more like Metal Gear Solid 2, where every scene has like a tracked camera that follows Snake, but it allows some really cool angles. And it really makes the game look like exceptionally good. And I actually think it lost some of the visual flair when you switch to a normal third-person right-stick camera, because those camera angles were very carefully chosen to look a certain way, and they were good at that. It was just the industry was kind of shifting at the time, and I can see why they would have switched, but still, I would love to see them, since they're staying so close to the original anyway, it would be nice if they kept that toggle option where you could essentially bring in the fixed camera angles.
Oh, actually, they do. They do.
Wait, they have that as an option?
They do, yeah, they do. It's quite
no way.
Yeah.
Dude!
So they really are going back in time.
That's incredible. All right. That actually further increases my hype then for this. That's fantastic. Yeah. So this really is just a 1-to-1 copy of Metal Gear Solid 3, but with fancy visuals. Fascinating.
Really? Looks like it. I mean, I can't see any major changes. Maybe there'll be some tweaks, but this does seem like basically 1-to-1 with what Kojima shipped way back 20 years ago.
All right. The fact that they can do that shows how ahead of its time it was, I would say. My gosh, that game. I wonder if they'll keep the Guy Savage stuff, though. I'm going to guess not. Are you familiar with that?
No, what is that, John?
So that's that part, and I was lucky enough to encounter this the first time I played MGS3, because you won't always see it on your playthrough, but essentially the point where you get captured and thrown in prison, if you save your game, quit out of the game, and then reload your save. So like the first time I just saved my game and quit right there, and then I loaded it up the next time, and you load it up, and suddenly you're playing this 60 FPS weird dreamy looking brawler thing where you're like slicing through dudes with like gore everywhere. And I remember at the time looking at my CRT and I saw it switch to field rendering mode. Like you can tell that the PS2 changed resolution. You're like, wait, what? And then it's this other game. and then you're just like running through this nightmare, slicing dudes to bits. It's extremely bloody. And then Snake, or Big Boss, like snaps awake, and you're like, what happened? Right? So it's just like this weird little dream sequence. But as it turns out, it was actually a completely different engine, and it was some sort of like a prototype thing that had been in development.
That's funny.
And they stuck it in there. But from what I remember, that did not appear in the HD re-releases of the game, which kind of makes sense given that it's a completely different engine. It literally loaded like a different EXE, and then the whole system was just, which is,
that's crazy.
It's cool. It was amazing that they did that. But and so since they're staying very close to that original, I actually do wonder, would they go through the effort of implementing that here? Like
I would imagine actually almost so,
awesome.
given how, like you were just describing the slavish adherence to the original design, including the camera system, which I'm surprised about. You know, Capcom, when they remake these games, they take a lot of creative liberty with them. There's obviously, the design has a lot of the same structure, but it's like RE2 is completely different in a lot of ways.
Different game,
yeah, and even Resident Evil 3 is way different. Here,
Extremely.
I would love to see that, and it wouldn't be the first time we've seen that in a modern game. I was just thinking about the Wolfenstein games. They do the exact same sleeping, different gameplay thing.
You're right.
If you recall that, that was funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can play the original Wolf.
I remember that. You walk. It's like you sleep in the home base there. And he's like muttering to himself about like the dream that he had.
Yeah, like I could see like health power ups and treasure blinking.
Oh man, that's I love that kind of stuff. I'm such a sucker for that.
That game's great.
That's fantastic.